Okay, good evening all. This is probably going to be one of the most complex videos I will do. So what I'll try and do is first a summary of the main issues of Corbyn's speech and what it actually means. And then I'm going to go through all the notes that I made, because after I watched his speech, I went through the actual text to try and dig out all of the stuff there, because there's been a ton of it. So here's the summary. And that is that it's Labour maintaining its stance of deliberate constructive ambiguity. It's something for everyone. There were sound bites for Brexiteers, sound bites for Remainers. And so what you'll have as a response, and what you have seen as a response, is a lot of die-hard Remainers saying, he's not opposing Brexit, he's saying it's going ahead, blah. And a lot of Brexiteers saying, betrayal, betrayal, he's, rolling back on what Brexiteers voted for. And a lot of pragmatists in the middle going, this seems to be a step towards a softer Brexit, I wonder where it's going to end up. So anyway, the way I see it is that on the surface, it covers a whole load of issues and was trying to keep everyone happy in a way and seem like the big diplomat, healing all the bonds. At a deeper level, there are lots of weapons here hidden in the long grass specifically for Remain. Actually, one of those, the most overt one, was of course the customs union. I'll talk about that in a bit. Then there's another one with the demands surrounding the meaningful vote, what Labour are going to be triggered by in order to support or remove support. And then there was a lot of talk on basically a whole set of other issues that set a philosophical stance. And then Jeremy Corbyn actually did a lot to pull the teeth of Brexit, because there are two issues where Brexit is meant to be economically beneficial, and that's rolling back on regulations, and he attacked that hard, and the other one is coming out of the customs union and doing our own free trade deals, and basically he tried to shut that down. So that leaves Brexit without an economic stance, and he didn't actually give any economic advantages for Brexit until he was harassed in the Question Times. Okay, so now let's talk about those two specific key weapons. One is the customs union, and the second one is the meaningful vote. With the customs union, by saying we want to stay long-term in a customs union with the EU, but just with the voice for it, then he is essentially backing the government rebels that have said they would vote against the customs bill. That is powerful, because then the government could actually fail to get that through and fall on that, and then it could even ramify quite quickly into a change of prime minister, or an election, or another referendum, or what have you. So that could really kick things off. And that is what he is doing with that. I bloody hope that he has checked out this option with the EU before he goes and flags it up, that you can have a UK-EU deal where you have reasonable balance of input into outward-facing deals. I hope that he has checked that out and can back that up. But anyway, that's weapon one, and that's for the customs bill coming up. Weapon two is that at several points he made the point that Labour would not support a Brexit deal that damages jobs. Labour expect the government to be held to a deal that David Davis promised in the House of Commons. And so the implication was very, very strongly set up, and there are quotes in this, that if Labour don't see this being an absolute economic boon to all sections of our population, then they reserve the right to vote against it. What would happen in that circumstance if then Labour have already said they think a meaningful vote, the other alternative can't be no deal, the other alternative therefore has to be no Brexit. This puts the government into chaos, and either they have a change of leader, or a general election or a referendum. A referendum would split the Tories. They'd probably go for a general election in order to try and get a majority, and then Labour at that stage can decide whether they want to offer in their manifesto a better Brexit, a renegotiation and then a vote, a renegotiation and entry, so Remain and Reform, or whatever they think is going to fly with the public at that stage. But they have basically, through this, kept all options on the table, if not putting it overtly. Right, so that is my overall summary. If that's all you wanted to see, you can stop watching now. Now I'm going to go through the actual details of the talk, because it does range across a whole load of issues around Labour thinking and Jeremy Corbyn's heart that have been very, very much off the radar because he has not been talking about this. So I actually want to go through this speech and highlight a few little gems in there that you might not have noticed. So here we go. He started off by saying the government don't know what they want. They don't know what they want on Brexit. We respect the result, but we need a Brexit that is the best deal for jobs, living standards, economy, yada yada. We reject the race to the bottom. We are pro-EU citizens' rights. We don't want a hard border in Ireland. And importantly, we want a meaningful vote in Parliament, okay, on the deal. He then says that the UK government, the Tories, have given us lots and lots of years of damage on top of austerity. They don't know what they want. They've got no plan for running this country, no plan for Brexit. Boris Johnson on the NHS, why would he put that money into the NHS when over all of the 8 years that we've had so far, the Tories haven't invested in the NHS? Then he says, and this is interesting, we would use the funds returned from Brussels to invest in public services. So he is trying to steal Boris Johnson's pledge and saying it's more credible coming from me. However, I find this to be very false, because we all know that there is no Brexit dividend. That 0.5% of GDP associated with our net contribution, we've burnt it already, and we would burn it even harder by trying to pull that plug. So that is a false promise right there that irked me. Now, he then said, Brexit must not leave us worse off. This is a repeated theme, okay? Brexit is not acceptable if it leaves us worse off. He says, we are leaving the European Union, but we are not leaving Europe. So parroting Tory rhetoric there. But he says, we're not protectionist, we're outward focused. There are leave areas where the system seemed rigged against them. And so these people voted for Brexit, but we need a deal that is good for all and invests in them. Labour wants a Brexit for all people. Labour is looking for a Brexit that puts working people first. Those quotes made me want to throw up, because Labour does not want a Brexit, and Labour is not looking for Brexit. Labour as a party campaigned against Brexit, so it can't be wanting one now, and it can't be looking for one now. It should only be looking to mitigate against the thing that they voted for, because they knew all along it was bad. For me, that's how it should be phrased. You can say the public voted for this, so we should be going through with it in case they change their mind, but I don't think you should be saying the Labour Party wants this or is looking for this, because that is actually untrue of the Labour membership and the Labour voters and the Labour parliamentarians on the whole. Just a little point there that I think you should be aware of. That language made me feel a bit ill. Corbyn then says 45 years of working together has built some really good agencies like the European Food Standards Agency, the European Chemicals Agency. Look at the production of a Mini, he says, interwoven supply chains cross the channel 4 times over. And so he's talking about the sheer complexity of what we have built with Europe. And then he says it makes no sense to leave those EU agencies and leave that tariff-free trade that has served us so well. He says it is better to pay to play in that rather than try and duplicate it at cost. And then he highlights Euratom and the importance of staying in that, and the Erasmus scheme and the benefits of that. Okay? So he says it is obvious that we should be remaining close to the EU because all European countries do. Look at Turkey, look at Switzerland, look at Norway and Liechtenstein. They are all involved in the EU frameworks. Okay? So he says we need to stay in the single market and customs union during transition. This is something that Labour proposed first. The government agreed to it. Looks like the government are now backing out. And then here's a really important set of statements that come in the middle. And I'm going to read this to you word for word. Labour would seek a final deal that gives full access to European markets and maintains the benefits of the single market and customs union, as the Brexit Secretary David Davis promised in the House of Commons, with no new impediments to trade and no reduction in rights, standards and protection. Now that is a very legally sounding text saying basically they intend to hold the government to David Davis's wild promises. That is what they expect in the final deal, and if they don't get it, they reserve the right to reject it because there can be no deal that makes Britain poorer. So that is a really interesting bind there that sets things up. He then goes on to say the customs union is a viable deal. You can have a UK-EU customs union for tariff-free trade within it and for the security of Northern Ireland. The only demand we would be making is that, of course, we get a say in all of the outward-facing deals that the EU is negotiating with its customs union. So that 50 plus, and building on that, we would want a say on that. Fair enough. And I hope to God that he's actually checked that out with people in the EU before putting himself out on that. Now, he then says the government has ruled out the customs union. He wants to push them into that box and saying, no, they're not going to roll back on this. That's what the government want. This is what I want. Here's the blue water between us. They're crazy, we're rational. So he wants to put them in that box and say the Labour Party now has a different Brexit position from the government. So that's an important indicator because he sees the government failing on Brexit and he wants an angle of attack on the government on Brexit. This is what he hasn't done before. He's been dodging the issue before by setting up a clear contrast. He can't look like May's handmaiden anymore, well, in his mind. And there's an angle where they can actually now be constantly attacking the government on matters of Brexit, okay? He then says, I appeal to MPs of all parties to put people's interests before ideological fantasies. So this is about the customs bill now. And even though it is essentially driven by rebels within the government, instead of saying, we back those rebels, he's saying, I call for this and I call on rebels to support me. Okay, so he's trying to pick up the glory there. But in practical dynamics, this is now Labour and the rebels against the government. Who is going to win on the customs bill? Because if the government don't get this break from the customs union, then basically that shatters their whole economic argument of being outside in the world and free trading by yourself and profiteering wildly from that. If they don't have parliamentary support from that, that really pulls a tooth from Brexit. And the other tooth being pulled, the other fang, the two fangs, the other one is regulations. And Jeremy Corbyn is all over saying that we're not going to roll back on standards. Right? So then he feels the need to repeat again, we respect the referendum and Britain is leaving the EU. That really annoyed me. But we will not support a Tory deal which does lasting damage. So it seemed as though he was going to say we respect the referendum, but we won't support a Tory deal that leaves lasting damage. But then he decided to slip in, and Britain is leaving the EU, just so that softens it. So that's an interesting mixed bag there. Then goes on to say US and China have weaker regulations than what the Brits and Europeans have developed together, and we will not roll down to those. We oppose a deal with Trump's America, he said, on opening up the NHS, and then he dropped in something about, and we will not accept a revised TTIP with the EU, which is slightly annoying because with TTIP, the people power of the European people through the Parliament forced transparency and actually protected all of the national health systems against any interference. So that was a little bit of ignorance on his part. But that dynamic of threat to the NHS, is flagging that up with the Trump deal, which is important. Then, another interesting part, he said he would negotiate a new single market deal based on existing rights and protections. And he said this deal must support the Labour programme. So he would be asking them for exemptions and clarifications to make sure that the single market deal would work with Labour's programmes. What's happening there is that basically he's saying we are willing to be in the single market, which is essentially under some EU laws, but that's acceptable to us so long as we get clarifications or clarity on the fact that we can renationalise. So he knows full well that this isn't really a problem. The single market isn't really a problem for renationalisation, but if that is just clarified by the EU for everyone, or put explicitly that the UK has some exemptions on that part, then that gives him opportunity to argue for the single market, saying that this doesn't threaten the Labour agenda. That's what that's about. He then moves from that to actually going on to an attack of the Leave campaign. He talks about xenophobia. He says proponents of the Leave campaign did a shameful campaign, and he also ties in Theresa May and her go-home vans while she was Home Secretary. He said that was appalling. He says immigration has been high recently because of skill shortages in the UK and immigrants coming in to help out and fill that out. We shouldn't base an immigration policy on numbers. We should base it on what is productive for our country. And he said we need stronger employment laws to make sure that's not the case. And he said, and I quote, "It's not immigrants that drive down wages." And that, for me, that point is excellent, because the government have actually peddled lies on that front. They have hidden reports on that front. Reports that have shown that immigration has depressed wages slightly at the lower end by a minuscule amount relate to immigration from outside the EU, not in the EU, but that has been misrepresented by the government. Generally speaking, immigrants complement jobs in the UK rather than compete with them, and this is particularly so of EU immigration. So he gunned on that point in the right way, and I'm pleased about that. Here's a very interesting thing that happened next. Jeremy Corbyn talked about Northern Ireland and gave tribute to Mo Mowlam and Tony Blair. So he gave tribute and credit to Tony Blair about Northern Ireland. And I think that is a big outreach to the centre. Very interesting. Will it win people over? I don't know, but that made me sit up. He said, we want a close relationship outside the EU based on solidarity and common principles and yada yada. That's not very interesting. Our government have said that. Here's an interesting thing that comes up next. The corporate elite. The corporate elite that Jeremy Corbyn so dislikes, and well, hey, you know, don't most of us, the small gang of companies that works internationally and plays different countries off each other and gets their own tax rules like that. Here's what he said about the corporate elite. Working with European neighbours, we should be stopping those corporate elites who play countries off against each other. Brilliant. So he is highlighting what the EU has been doing, which is herding countries together to say, no, you can't play us off against each other. And that's the language that I use, you know, these big companies trying to play countries off against each other. So that solidarity of common purpose to resist that, he highlights. So he doesn't attack the EU as a corporatist club like he has before. Rather, he highlights the solidarity of the countries against those actually global multinationals that should be held to account by us collectively and that collective bargaining. He also talks about the international responsibility of countries working together on climate change, on low carbon goods, on the global refugee crisis and coordination Europe-wide on that, and then saying that international cooperation is important. Look at when we've had unilateral efforts at regime change and how that's messed up. It needs to be done within international frameworks. Then, with that in mind, this was beautiful. He went straight for Theresa May's quote about, she said, citizens of the world are citizens of nowhere. And then Corbyn said, Brits are citizens of the world. And that was beautiful. And so kudos to him on that, because that throws real bone to people like the science community that were really horrified by that particular statement. So it shows that awareness of that. So for those that have been doing Corbyn down, yeah, I've still got problems with Corbyn. Yes, I know there's stuff in here that's cherry picking and that's implausible or impossible, but at the same time, he is showing a tip of the hat to various communities which he has ignored to date and which are rich in the Labour Party. So he is showing that he has awareness of various issues here, and that was a big one for me. Then he explains that he was opposed to the free market thinking in the EU and democratic deficit in the EU, and that's why he was a skeptic of the EU, but he believed that we should be remaining and reforming. And he said, you should not confuse healthy skepticism with being anti-European, because he is not. Now, why does he say this? Because he's fully aware of all those people have been saying Corbyn is a secret Brexiteer, Corbyn is a secret Brexiteer, that's his agenda. He at least is trying to diffuse that here and saying, no, I was just healthily sceptic, I campaigned for Remain and Reform, I still would vote Remain, that's where my heart is. So that is an outreach on his part, and that's an awareness on his part that he needs to diffuse this notion that he is a Brexiteer by nature. He then goes to inequality stuff and says, in or out of the EU, this is the key thing that we need to deal with, market failures and austerity. And then he winds up with, the EU is not the root of our problems and leaving it will not solve all problems. Likewise, it's not the source of all enlightenment and leaving it is not necessarily doom. Brexit is not a disaster. Brexit is not a land of milk and honey. Brexit is in our hands, and it is what we make of it. I would dispute that last sentence, because it isn't just what you make of it if you're actually pulling the plug on so many different frameworks. You are actually hampering yourself, and you're hampering the money that you're going to get in. So you will have less money to make of it what you want to. But that was a sort of wind-up where he's trying to be the big sort of diplomat that, you know, some people think this, some people think that, but there are too many extreme opinions around, you know, I'm in the centre and I'm all very pragmatic. That's what he's trying to do there. So again, I come back to my summary, which is, this has actually been a very, very useful talk. I know it's been a mess and trying to throw bones to everyone, but it's given us lots of insights into his thinking and his motivations. At no stage did he praise Brexit or talk about opportunities in Brexit. He rather talked about the risks and also took away the regulations, you know, any benefits there, said no, leaving the customs union, no benefits there. So basically showed Brexit to be no opportunities there, something that you mitigate, you try and get the best deal. If you can't get the best deal, or the government can't get the best deal, then that's not a deal that our party would accept. So whatever happens from here, as I don't know his mind, whatever happens from here, you can clearly see that it's trying to keep everyone happy. It's trying to keep all options on the table. They think that ambiguity is being a good thing, but they know they need to put in clear water between them and the Tories so that they can attack Brexit. And they have put weapons in the long grass to actually allow themselves, if it seems appropriate at the time, because that's where public opinion is, they have got those weapons hidden that they can pull out again and say, you know what, this deal doesn't satisfy the people and this deal doesn't satisfy what you promised, and they reserve the right to sort of pull the plug on that. So that is my analysis of where we are. I would be grateful for your comments as always. Thank you.